Hello, hello. This video is all about chop saws. We're gonna go through the process of setting one up, or at least double checking it. I think mine on the vertical needs adjusted a little bit, so we'll go through that process and I'll show you some tips and some tricks, maybe some jigs and some fixtures that you can use to get the most out of this glorious machine. So first off, you'll notice that my chop saw is in this little cove, and that's because these are dusty machines, right? I do have a shop vac, automated shop vac connected to this, but still you get a lot of debris flying around and they make a mess. So this little enclosure, it helps. And it's just the nature of the beast, I guess. The second thing, you may have noticed that this is really tall. I'm not very tall myself, but this is up about 44 inches to this level, and then this drops down about 4 inches. So my work is really up close where I can see it well. I've got a nice light, really bright light. It's like a heat lamp. It's a heater and a light in the winter. I typically don't use this, for a long time, so the heat isn't really an issue, but I love the bright light. Release that guy. Okay, and then the second thing is this is hollow underneath here. There's a big hole that's about 20 inches by probably about 17 inches. So all this debris that I have here, offcuts or sawdust or whatever, it just goes down in here. Open this up and I have this built-in trash can, right? I put a couple of angled wedges on each side down at the bottom, so when I put this in and move it back, it centers within the opening. That works fantastically well. And when it gets full or whatever, I just dump it. Makes a huge difference. So here to the right of the chop saw, I've got the shop vac. It's an old Fiend, and it's automated back, it's probably 20 years old. And back, 20 years ago, they weren't even that popular. Most shop vacs were not automated. And it works okay, but I just keep it dedicated for the chop saw here. You can see one line goes to the chop saw. I've got this little shop-made manifold, so the other side goes to my little vertical drum sander, right? And it works great. Captures most of the dust, and of course the little shroud that helps contain it as well. If I'm doing a lot of cutting, I just keep the door open so it doesn't get too hot. In reality, I should have put a vent or a grill on this door, but just haven't. You know how that goes. So with this particular chop saws and a lot of other brands that I've seen, this fence is adjustable, and it looks like it's just one solid piece of cast aluminum, but this can twist or bend. And so you need a good quality straight edge. This would be one of the first things that you'd want to check. And by putting my straight edge up against here, I can see that is dead on accurate, nice and straight, with no twist in either fence. If one is slightly off, this has 4 bolts. Let's see, 2 over here and 2 here. You would just loosen those or loosen maybe 2 of them and twist this whichever way you need it. And this will literally bend, even though that's all one piece. Of course, I want my adjacent surfaces level with my saw. So that was pretty easy to do when I was building this, and it looks like that's a little low actually. This has a little bit of wear, so I might have to shim that maybe 4 or 5 thousandths sheet of paper or something, but it's not bad. This is actually pretty good. This insert looks a little bit low, and typically that's not a problem unless you're cutting a small block of wood, which I don't know why you would want to cut something this small on a chop saw. Could be dangerous. But if you were cutting something that small, this could tip down. I don't know if you can see that gap there, but that little piece of wood would actually rock. Dangerous operation, I would never suggest that. I'll show you what I do when I'm cutting smaller pieces here in a little bit. But at some point I'll probably make a new insert that is actually flush. So in this particular saw, there's a bolt here that needs to be loosened to gain access to the arbor nut. And what I like doing is putting this longer bolt that I have, and that'll hold my guard open. It just makes it easier when I'm doing adjustments. So I can bring this down, and on each side of the blade, okay, safety first, got the chop saw unplugged. So on each side of the blade, I can bring a square down and check that. And this is a vertical part that I was mentioning earlier that I think is off, and it is. It needs to go, it needs to tilt to the right. Let me check this side. Yep, sure enough. And on this particular saw, yeah, boy, that is tight. That loosens, and there's an adjustment knob here, and I had adjusted it. A lot of times if I adjust that bolt and I'm off just a little bit, rather than fiddling with that bolt, and I don't know why manufacturers don't use fine thread screws. It seemed like that would be a better adjustment. This one's just a standard thread. But rather than trying to adjust that, I'll just add tape, and I can sneak up on a good adjustment. For whatever reason, it's off. So I'm gonna take that tape out, tighten this back up, and see if that makes a difference. That actually looks pretty good. Of course, a strong light behind the square will really show up if there's any gap. And it's always a good idea to rotate the blade and check a couple of different areas. Use a good quality blade. This is Elite. I know it's a good plate on this blade, so that will make a big difference. Oh, and incidentally, this particular chop saw is the DeWalt DW705. All right, that's great. So I ended up putting one piece of tape underneath that rather than moving that bolt, and I'm dead 90 on the vertical. This is nice and straight. We're dead 90 on the vertical, and now we can check the relationship between the fence and perpendicular. We're 90 degrees to the blade here. I'm gonna grab a bigger square. That looks good, actually. Check this side. Yeah, man, that's beautiful. Rotate the blade. Looks good. Another way to check both vertical and horizontal once your fence is dead straight is just take a board, and if it's cut on the table saw and the table saw is tuned up properly, this should cut parallel. I mean, even a table saw that's not set up properly will still cut parallel for the most part. I'm going to check this. 128, kind of tricky. 128.29 millimeters. 128.30. 128.29. This is pretty parallel. Okay. So what we can do is we can mark a line across this. And as I mentioned earlier, this would work for both, horizontal or a vertical cut. So let me get this blade guard back in place. Please continue to hold. Once you make that cut, you should be able to flip one of them, and as long as your fence is straight, or check on a known straight edge, zero gap, right? And the wider your board, the more that error or accuracy will be magnified. So you could cut something on this particular saw up to about 8 inches wide, and it would tell you if that's cutting perpendicular or 90 degrees, which this one is dead on. And like I mentioned, it would work the same for a vertical cut. You can also do this on a table saw or a band saw. If this was off any, I love this particular saw, and I think most saws are actually like this. They have this plate that's one piece, and you simply loosen, I think 3 screws. Yeah, there's 3 screws. The holes are elongated, so you just slightly loosen that, move this the direction you need, tighten everything back. But this one has been calibrated and is awesome. Those are tight. So that's a really good design. Yeah, man. Dead on balls accurate. It's an industry term. So hopefully the background noise isn't too distracting. I live next to a sod farm and they are literally peeling up sod. So anyway, one of the next things that we need to do is check the fence for 90 degrees this direction. And I've already adjusted this before, and it seems to stay. So that is really beautiful. That is just right. And actually, I don't know if this even has an adjustment, although you could loosen this and shim it with, paper. And I suppose that when you're getting this fence straight would be the time to make it 90 degrees as well. But this one's good. Thought I'd show you this real quick. This is the little bolt that you open this up so you can access this arbor nut. I just have this other one that is longer and it'll hold this guard open. Not a big deal, but does make it a little bit easier. Oh, and incidentally, let me see if this shows up. Actually, let me move the camera. This is a piece of aluminum that I bent and attached here, kind of a shroud. I noticed a lot of this dust seems to go to the left, and I don't know why, but with this shroud, it kind of deflects against that and goes through the dust chute there. So, little things will make a difference, right? So I know there's different ways to do this. A lot of people won't even have a fence here. They'll just have it, down flush with maybe a retractable stop, or they'll have this back so it's not in the way. I've never had a problem with this. If I have a crooked board, I just either shim it or flip it over. It's really not an issue. I like this in line. This is a Bismeyer stop. I don't believe they even make these anymore, but it's simple but very effective. Of course, this will only go down to about 15 inches. So if I need to cut something shorter than that repeatedly, I just have this little 10-inch block, or I have a 20-inch block here. So if I wanted to cut something, let's say 3 3/16, set that on 23 3/16 and make my cut. This L fence is invaluable. I use this thing all the time. It's sacrificial. In other words, it'll get cut up to where it's not really usable anymore, and then I just throw it away. I just noticed something funny. I typically make these. This is glued on, and then I use screws to hold it in place, and then I remove the screws, and I forgot to remove the screws. So good thing that I noticed that. I don't want to cut into one of those. But typically I will use this to, if I'm making small cuts, or if I need to back up a miter, just all kinds of reasons to make one of these. You can make your first cut, and then you have an exact placement of where your cut's going to be. A lot of times I'll put this where it goes. Let's say right in there. Maybe I'll be cutting to the right of the blade, so I'll cut a little bit of this material off. Once I like where that is going to sit, I can add these clamps. These clamps, they just live in this little cubby. Boom. One there, one here. That makes a huge difference. Years ago when I used to install, I would occasionally have to take this out in the field, and so that's why there's these large wing nuts. So it's just 2 bolts that hold this in place, but it doesn't go anywhere anymore. And so it's solid in that spot so that my fence to the left and to the right are calibrated, you know, from the blade to the markings on the fence. So here's a little tip that you can do if you're cutting a small piece of trim like this, and say you needed a clean cut in the front, it needed to be clean on the top and clean in the back. So if you're going to cut it like this back is going to blow out even with a good blade. And sure, you could back that up with another piece of wood, but let me show you another way. So to start, I'm going to make this cut. You can see it's clean in the front, clean on top, splintered in the back. Does that show up? Even with a good quality blade. So, if you didn't have something to back it up, what a guy can do, or a girl, is tilt this at an angle. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna bring the relationship or the angle of attack of those teeth into that board at a different angle, and it's gonna produce a better cut. Let me show you what I mean. Hearing protection. So I'm going to put this at about a 45-degree angle, somewhere in there. It's down tight to the table, it's tight to the fence. Let's make that cut. That was kind of weird. Sometimes that electronic brake doesn't kick on. Anyway, beautiful, right? Nice and clean in the back. Of course, it's gonna be clean on top and clean in the front. Bottom is splintered still, and if you needed that to count all the way around, of course, that would be the time to use something like that. All right, so here at the chop saw, if I was to be cutting a frame, I like cutting this angle, this direction, rather than that configuration, because this will tend to splinter out a little bit. If this is the inside, I suppose I could clean that up, but what makes more sense to me is to put it this way. If this chips out slightly, which it'll be minimal because of the grain direction, it has less resistance, so it'll cut easier and chip out less, versus this, you're cutting into this grain, and so it'll have the propensity to chip out slightly more. In addition, once the frame is made, you can easily clean up the outside edges. Make sense? Let's go ahead and give this a cut. So of course, here in the front, those 2 cuts are going to be clean. This has a little bit of splinter out. You can see how that chipped out right there, right? And this one is nice and clean. So it does make a difference. So something to keep in mind. Might make your cuts better when you're cutting like a mitered frame or trim or whatever, yeah?
Here, I just wanted to show how effective it is to back something up, even if it's just with an 1/8" piece of MDF.
So this is absolutely one of my favorite accessories for the chop saw. And with this thing, I can cut really small parts, and they don't, you know, I don't end up with every other one or every third one while the others are ricocheting across the shop. And just made with some simple shop vac parts, right? You can see the mesh screen in there. And then this component will go here. I've already got this zero clearance fixture in place. This guy will go here, add a screw, okay. Then this dude goes on here. I add a vacuum hose, and boom, I'm ready to go. All those parts will get caught in here within the screen, And then I can remove this, dump those out, and then continue. This thing is awesome. I use it all the time. Well, when I cut small parts, it works amazingly well. Let me put it that way. Yeah, man.
So with these two shop vac components, I was able to make this small parts catcher. I cut this part at the bandsaw, right? Here you can see that I've added it to this small maple board with a 45-degree angle. And with the extension tube, I've cut it into two separate parts, and I'll add this screen mesh. I used some 5-minute epoxy and clamped everything in place. And there's a good shot of the screen. There's the components all ready to go. Super simple, very effective. All right, here it is in action. I'm cutting some little Paduke wedges, right? And the vacuum's running. And this is actually on my small 10-inch chop saw. I don't remember why I did that, but anyway, here it is. You can see the parts are being cut, and the vacuum just sucks them right into this little cavity that captures them with the screen. So this was my original one, but the hose is too small, and the screen was a little bit too tight of a mesh. And it worked good, but you had to, it would clog quickly. So this one's a lot bigger. You can see the bigger mesh in there. And this is just some of this plastic screen from Vacuum Press. Has about an eighth inch mesh. Works much better. Creates these beautiful wedges. And smooth sides with a gradual taper so they get super tight. I prefer these cut this way versus using a bandsaw. And of course, note the direction of the grain on this narrow board. Yeah, man, that's how you do it. That's how I do it. And I prefer a shim with a very gradual taper. A gradual taper means you're going to have more contact with the split in the tenon. More contact area means more glue surface, means stronger joint. And that's what we're after. Beautiful, tight, strong. Well, there you go. I certainly hope you got some use out of this video. Thanks a ton for watching. Remember to click, like, subscribe, learn.